throughout the discussion, please use the chat room. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. We have participants from all over the world, which is great. Thank you for joining us today in our Summit for Democracy side event by the Terrorism, Transnational Crime, and Corruption Center at the Schar School for Policy and Government, George Mason University. We also thank our partners, the National Democratic Institute, as well as Global Financial Integrity, for the support that tracks Anti-Illicit Trade Institute, including our recent course on transnational crime, money laundering, and illicit finance from authoritarian states. My name is David Luna, and I am the co-director of the Anti-Illicit Trade Institute at TRAC. Make no mistake, democracy is under siege. As President Biden outlined earlier today in the U.S. strategy on countering corruption released this morning, corruption threatens the United States' national security, economic equity, global anti-poverty and development efforts, and democracy itself. We concur. In fact, illicit finance and kleptocracy are so pervasive threats that in addition to undermining democracy, they corrode the rule of law, fuel impunity, imperil effective implementation of national sustainability and economic development strategies, contribute to human rights abuses, and inflame violent conflicts. These threats become magnified when they are advanced by authoritarian states to finance greater insecurity and instability around the world, and in a manner that harms our national security and those of other democracies. The corruptive influence by authoritarian forces can be seen and felt across borders and in every corner of the globe. This is especially true when dictators or corrupt ruling elites conspire with criminals to manipulate weak governance structures, erode judicial independence, and quash anti-corruption investigations and the rule of law, so that democracy cannot take hold or the voice of citizens cannot be heard. The malign and criminal behaviors by authoritarian states, for example, through kleptocracy and illicit finance, are existential threats to democracy. Our discussion today will further illuminate the destabilizing effects of these threats and the dangers that they pose to democracy, peace, and security, and why we must diligently inform communities with facts and evidence-based research on the impacts of authoritarianism. Finally, we must support a whole of society approaches to counter today's transnational security vectors, including the convergence of kleptocracy, organized crime, and threat finance. In short, sustaining the light of democracy must be our resolute challenge. Before introducing our very distinguished speakers for the first session, let me ask my co-chair, Dr. Laila Hashemi, to also make some brief introductory comments. Laila.
Thank you, David. My name is Laila Hashemi, and I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at TRAC. Thanks for joining today's event discussing authoritarianism, violence, and illicit trade. TRAC's work is unique in that our research sits at the nexus of so many pressing international issues. With the upcoming Summit for Democracy, we believe it's critical for research institutes like ours to be involved in the conversation regarding issues such as corruption, human rights, and transnational crime. Our projects cover a wide variety of topics, including human trafficking, illicit wildlife trade, money laundering, antiquities smuggling, global terrorism, and illicit supply chains, just to name a few. Our faculty and staff is international, multidisciplinary, and some of the leading experts in their fields. Over 1/3 of the world's population lives under authoritarian rule, and only approximately 8% live under governing systems that are considered full democracies. These figures demonstrate the need to identify and address the root causes of this democratic backsliding. A global crisis, COVID-19, brought with it rising levels of violence, threats to public health, and human insecurity. One of TRAC's research grants funded by the National Science Foundation has revealed the flood of counterfeit respirators and other medical products during the pandemic. Through the establishment of public-private partnerships that use advanced data analytics, we've contributed to the seizure of over 55 million respirators and the takedown of tens of thousands of listings attempting to introduce fake and harmful products into legitimate supply chains. Again, thank you for joining us. We hope that today's discussion is just the beginning of a long-term conversation about the state of democracy, both around the world and at home.
Thank you, Laila. Now, I'm honored to introduce our three panelists for this session. The first is Dr. Louise Shalley, the director of TRAC Lenny Omer, and Nancy Hurst, endowed chair, followed by Claudia Escobar, a former judge of the Court of Appeals of Guatemala and a respected legal scholar. And finally, Corina Rebegia, advisor for anti-corruption and governance with the National Democratic Institute. Dr. Shelley.
Thank you. And it's a delight to be with you today on this memorable day in which we've had the launch of an anti-corruption strategy in this country and a new strategy to deal with money laundering into real estate. Unlike Claudia, who follows me, who has lived in an authoritarian state and has suffered the human consequences of this, I came to this problem through observation. And I lived in the Soviet Union in the mid-1970s. And then 30 years ago, I saw that organized crime and corruption associated with the USSR's collapse was a fundamental problem. But unlike others around me who thought of it as transitional, I thought of it as enduring. And unfortunately, that insight has proved to be true. But what I saw at that time was that all the hopes that existed under Glasnost for a decline in authoritarianism, that this rise of the corruption and the organized crime would eventually lead to a decline in democracy, the hope that there would be free markets instead of a centrally planned economy would be hijacked by the crime and the corrupt officials, that the media that had been so constrained under the Soviet rule would be bought up and the voices of journalists would be muffled and their lives would be threatened, and that the labor controls that existed in the authoritarian Soviet Union would not result in free labor, as you had a new form of authoritarianism administered not by the state, but by authoritarian kleptocrats. And I saw at that time major harm to the environment as the forests were being plundered by organized crime. Those phenomena that I described 30 years ago or in my writings are now, as we'll see in the next slide, a problem that we see across the world, that we're seeing, as Laila Hashemi referred to, a decline in democracy. We're seeing reduced press freedoms and many, many human rights violations that confront us every day in the global media. And the harm to the environment by corrupt officials that is leading to deforestation is not only a threat to democracy, but a threat to the sustainability of the planet, as the environmental destruction that results from this is going to make it very hard to lead to the sustainability goals that we need under COP26 as we face the existential threat of climate change. So all of these issues have an impact not only on the citizens of individual countries, but also on the citizens of the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Judge Escobar.
What's going on? You're mute.
You're muted.
Sorry. Hello, everyone, and thank you for this space and the opportunity to talk and to share with you about my experience and my point of view. I would like to talk about the culture of impunity in Central America, because over there, with the exception of Costa Rica, the states of Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, and Nicaragua face enormous challenges to confront corruption and international organized crime. The Northern Triangle in particular is considered one of the most violent regions on the planet and has become a prominent hub of international organized crime. Nicaragua, as many of you already know, is already ruled by a dictatorship by Daniel Ortega, and El Salvador is dangerously close to the same. Guatemala and Honduras, the corruption is systemic. In all these countries, the influence of corruption and criminal networks is enormous. Every day, thousands of citizens from this vulnerable region flee their home to escape violence, as evidenced by the situation at the southern US border. This instability and lack of governance in Central America affects the entire region and demands urgent action. Unfortunately, the efforts made by civil society, the support of the international community, and the commitment of a few honest public officials in these countries to strengthen the rule of law have not been sufficient to confront the illegal networks that run the kleptocratic and authoritarian governments. In July, the US State Department issued a public list of corrupt and democratic actors, sanctioning officials across all branches of government in all 3 northern state countries. This is not the first time, and it won't be the last, that the US government make a list of corrupt actors. But name and shame, sanctions are not going to establish democracy in the region. The United States, and I think the international community, must also recognize that these countries are in the hands of kleptocrats, and that it is impossible to deal with them as if they were democratic states. The whole system of governance in the region is broken, and it requires a stronger USA strategy that does more than just deal with grand corruption. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. As you said, we're doing this in partnership with NDI, and we're again honored to have you, Karina. Please share with them all the great thing that NDI is doing.
Thank you, David, and thanks for the invitation. It's really great to be part of this conversation. And you know, I concur with the analysis of the problem as Louise and Claudia have presented so far. And as you may know, NDI works in over 70 countries, and we are confronted with this in our work as well. This is corruption, kleptocracy, rising authoritarianism, democratic backsliding are all obstacles that we also face in our work. I would like to perhaps bring into the conversation the way we approach these issues of kleptocracy and authoritarianism and the way they enable each other, both in sort of in domestic context and on a transnational space, as Claudia has noted. And our approach is to focus on bolstering democratic institutions and practices. So we see these challenges as affecting not only, as you mentioned in your introduction, David, a lot of the aspects of our daily lives, but also just the fundamentals of democracies and democratic governance. So we think the best defenses is to go back to these fundamentals and support those structures, institutions, principles, practices, and close the loopholes and the opportunities for kleptocratic authoritarian actors to further undermine and subvert our system of democracy. And I think something that was also mentioned in this morning's launch of the new anti-corruption strategy of the US government by the US administration is this issue of democratic delivery. And this is why we're fighting back in the first place. And this is a sort of a core concern for NDI, working in a way that shows that building democracy, that supporting all these democratic processes actually deliver what citizens expect them to deliver. And corruption, kleptocracy are major challenges to this. And how we're doing this, I think it's important to note that in this effort to support and bolster our democratic defenses, we try to leverage transparency, accountability, and oversight in fighting both authoritarianism or foreign illiberal influences and kleptocracy and corruption. And we also do this by leveraging a variety of democratic actors. We look at things vertically, we look at things horizontally, and we're working to create more coalitions between different actors, including members of parliament, civil society, oversight institutions, local governments, And all of these private actors as well, trying to enable them and empower them to produce this change from within. And I'm happy to go into further detail later. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Karina. Let's start our conversation, as you mentioned, and others. The president, the White House released their strategy to combat corruption. Dr. Shelley, in your research on countering or really, informing the international community on the impact of authoritarian states, including kleptocracy, illicit finance, where do you see possible areas that the administration working with other democracies can work on to really, fight these illicit threats?
I think it's very important that we focus on the impact that corrupt individuals overseas have on our economy and our financial system. Because if they seem to have a safe haven to enjoy the riches that they have pillaged from their country, and then have impunity here and can live it up, it sends a very bad signal to the rest of the world and to countries that have suffered so much. So I think it's imperative for us not to be the enablers and not to provide an environment that allows individuals to absolutely benefit from their criminal and corrupt activity.
Yeah, I cannot agree with you more, Dr. Shelley, especially how the U.S. has become, in some ways, a safe haven for the illicit finance. And I know our colleagues in session 2 will address that a little bit more. Judge Escobar, in whether it's Guatemala or some of the other states in Central America, you underscored how these sanctuaries of impunity are problematic, and they do have a ripple effect. In your writings, you mentioned how the U.S. needs to leverage more of its trade agreements. What other areas do you think will be important in fighting authoritarianism in Central America?
Well, I think that first of all, we have to make a difference between strategies that will fight corruption and strategies to fight kleptocracy. And we need to understand that there are some countries that have become kleptocracies and that the strategies need to be different. So I think that there have to be in 2 different directions. One direction is to help the national institutions to strengthen the judiciaries and the institutions, that address security. But another strategy will be to develop international and regional bodies. And the US has announced, for example, the creation of an anti-corruption task force. I think that this has to be a reality and that they need to focus on that and create a regional task force. But at the same time, it's important to consider also the International Anti-Corruption Court that has been proposed by Judge Mark Wolf and an organization, because if the countries don't have the tools to fight corruption inside, we will need the international efforts, that can address this problem.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think, this task force that the DOJ has created has potential to really, again, bring to greater light some of the corrupt behaviors that are going on in Central America, and neighboring jurisdictions as well. Karina, you've worked a lot with civil society groups, and how do we, work within the international community, the community of democracies, to protect investigative journalists and other civil society champions who are really doing some good work who need to be protected?
Thanks for the question, David. I would start by saying that we're working with a lot of civil society partners in closed societies. And I think a lot of our partners there are doing tremendous work in exposing kleptocratic networks and corrupt officials. But sometimes their efforts, as do the efforts of investigative journalists, face the hurdles of the legal systems and the inability, for instance, of the international community to cooperate on having similar standards and norms. As Dr. Shelley mentioned, the issue of enablers. So I think as we're looking towards the Summit of Democracy, seeing more cooperation between countries and regional and multilateral bodies to harmonize and allow the information that comes from groups like civil society groups or journalist groups to sort of permeate and inform investigations that actually lead to impactful solutions. I think that's one way to do it. And I know there are a few other good proposals that are coming out of the US administration as we speak, including, as we've seen this morning, I think it's a fund on assets recovery, which is a really big issue for a lot of civil society around the groups around the world, and which will hopefully show that, again, the democratic processes and rule of law processes can deliver impactful results for citizens.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think this whole of society, I think, is very critical to protect those anti-corruption champions. Dr. Shelley, again, going back to your research, I'm looking at authoritarian states and the various, if you will, universe of illicit threats. But specifically, what are you seeing in terms of the trends of how some of these authoritarian states are leveraging organized criminal groups towards more harmful ways that impact democracies?
I think it's not just organized crime groups. In some cases, there are alliances between the government and organized crime, but in some of the most authoritarian and corrupt societies, the government has basically taken over the organized crime groups and made them do their bidding. So they're in charge, and the thugs work to enforce the personal economic interests and political interests of the corrupt leadership.
Right. Judge Escobar, coming back again to Guatemala, a lot of judges have been targeted as well. Not only for taking strong anti-corruption and integrity positions, but also for their voice and accountability, and so many have been exiled as well. How does the U.S. and the community of democracies begin to really strengthen the rule of law, but judicial independence in very difficult environments like Central America?
Can you repeat the question, David? I'm sorry.
So on judicial independence, how can the U.S. work with the community of democracies to strengthen judicial independence in Guatemala or other parts of Central America?
Well, it's important that we understand that the independence of the judiciary is needed in these countries, and also that the fight inside these countries for corruption is totally asymmetrical, because there is a fair alliance, between very powerful sectors. And I'm talking here about kleptocratic leaders or politicians, violators of human rights that are linked to the military sector, organized crime, economic elites that also benefit from corruption, and other powerful players, who will look for impunity for their crimes. So even though if there are some people that are willing to work for the justice system, it's not possible for them when they feel so much threats against them. And that's when the international community and the United States could really help in protecting them, but also in changing a system that favors corruption, because here the problem is the system, and the system needs to be changed.
A very, very good point. Public-private partnerships are very important. I'm looking at a question here from Matt Storr, and he's asking, what role and responsibilities should the global financial industry, again, I know that our colleagues will speak a little bit more about this. session two. But how can that sector or other industry partners work to increase our collective anti-corruption efforts? Louise, you want to take that on, and then we'll go to Karina.
I wanted to say something in response to the chat box, is that the financial community can do much more, just as the legislation, or FinCEN just issued a report on money laundering into real estate, which is an enormous repository of dirty money in the United States and in the UK. But there's also the issue of, once this money is recovered, how is it returned to the countries that are stolen, from which it is stolen, so it's not stolen again? And that strategy has not very well been developed. And it has been a problem for decades as more and more money piles up in the international financial community.
Right. I agree. Karina?
Absolutely. The private sector can do a lot. In our work, we see the private sector as a partner. So bringing them in the conversation and shaping policy and thinking about solutions so they can all be a part of this. And that's particularly important at a transnational level when it comes to recovering assets, but also to providing more transparency, not just through the work that they're doing, but also through the technologies and solutions they're implementing themselves. So that's on the one side, I think the constructive side. The second is not becoming enablers themselves. I think a lot of the conversation around the subversive nature of authoritarianism and kleptocracy revolves around how this has become sort of marketized or privatized in a way. And I think refraining from that and doing due diligence where perhaps the legislation does not provide it is equally important.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Claudia, please.
Yes, I think that Karina has touched a very important issue, and is private sector. And I also would like, to address that the free trade agreements are important in that sense. And the United States is the main economic partner of every country in the region. So I think that the free trade agreements need to be renegotiated and need to include chapters for the rule of law. And that will help, to create a region that will respect democracy and institutions.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think whether it's free trade agreements or foreign direct investment, I do think that the private sector can have a bigger voice in coordinating an overall robust response to advance a democratic value agenda with these states to do more. In the last minute that we have for this session, can I ask the three speakers for 1-2 solutions that they would like to see that they think will be effective in countering the illicit finance and kleptocracy related to authoritarian states? Dr. Shelley?
I think we need to implement the rules and the policies that we're developing, and to get rid of the gaping holes that still remain in the policies that are about to be implemented. There are just still too many ways to launder money and escape responsibility by kleptocrats.
Great. Claudia?
Yes, I would like to highlight, that the US needs to help this region, and in creating these international bodies, the Anti-Corruption Task Force, they also need to partner and involve multidisciplinary groups of people that understand the problem in the region, like lawyers, researchers, politicians, and that they have enormous experience. And that group should outline the strategies and the specific actions, against the kleptocratic regimens that we have right now in Central America.
Great. Karina?
Sure, perhaps 3 things. More support for local democratic forces, governmental and non-governmental. I think it's really important to look at at, as NDI calls them, game changers. Then more international action. I think we're seeing the beginning of that and working more in partnership, but I think a lot of the countries that have served as jurisdictions for all these corrupt officials need to work better together and with other actors to close those loopholes. And third, we have to make sure we're not making the problem worse through promoting all of these solutions. And by that, inadvertently, perhaps excluding actors that we shouldn't be excluding. And I'm thinking parliaments, just because these institutions or actors are just fundamental to supporting democratic governance and the principles that we're all standing behind.
Thank you for mentioning the role of parliamentarians. I think we need to do more with that community. So with that, Karina, Judge Escobar, I know Luis, you'll be closing this, but thank you for the three of you for your interventions. Let me turn it over to Dr. Hashemi.
Thank you very much, David. Yes, let me just get my slide going. So I have the pleasure of moderating a discussion with John Kasara and Lakshmi Kumar in our second session titled Illicit Financing of Crime, Violence, and Insecurity in Authoritarian States. I'll first invite our speakers to discuss their work and elaborate on the relationship between criminal financing, violence, and insecurity in authoritarian states. And then I'll ask our speakers to answer a few follow-up questions, and we welcome you to post your questions and comments in the chat. John Kasara is on the board of directors at Global Financial Integrity, GFI. Lakshmi Kumar is policy director at Global Financial Integrity. Both John and Lakshmi are senior fellows at TRAC AITI, where they've co-taught several courses on today's topics, including authoritarianism and illicit trade. And so I will pass it over to you first, John.
Thank you, Laila. And thank you all for being here. I very much want to thank the TRAC program for the wonderful opportunity to be part of it and to teach these courses. And it's been just an absolute honor and pleasure to work with Lakshmi and Dr. Shelley and David. It's a great team, and I think we put out a wonderful product. My background is law enforcement. I was with the Department of Treasury for many, many years, particularly specialized in anti-money laundering and later terrorism finance. I did a lot of investigations related to transnational crime. I've also written a little book. In the course of all this, I've been becoming increasingly concerned about transnational crime by authoritarian states and resulting money laundering. And I read a couple of papers about 4 or 5 years ago that made a big impact on me. One was put out by the OECD. The other was put out by Global Financial Integrity. And as you know, I'm on the board of GFI. But both papers talked about transnational crime in the developing world primarily, but looking at various sectors of crime. They talked about things like counterfeiting and intellectual property rights violations and drug trafficking and illegal logging and illicit tobacco and illegal wildlife trade, and cultural property theft, and all these types of things. And if you total all of these up, the totals reach approximately $2 trillion. $2 trillion. Now, I took away a couple points out of this. The first one is when I'm looking at all of these, the common denominator on all of this was China. China and the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP. That is the common denominator. They were the only country that was involved in all sectors of these crimes. The other one that just struck me is the magnitude of this. Roughly, as I said, $2 trillion. If you look at the magnitude of international money laundering around the world, again, the numbers are not precise, nobody knows, but roughly speaking, it's about, say, 4 trillion plus, okay, depending on what's included in the count. So from a law enforcement perspective, knowing that these numbers are not precise, but I can still make I think a rather strong argument that China is responsible for roughly 1/2 of the money laundering in the world as measured by predicate offenses. I think this is an extremely important point, something that needs to be discussed. And I think it also leads us to an important question that's basically been almost ignored in policymaking circles. Is China and the CCP using transnational crime as an instrument of state policy to advance their various strategic objectives? Is this a form of asymmetric warfare? Some of these predicate offenses or specified unlawful activities, we know there's a direct involvement by the government. A direct involvement by the government. So anyway, enough said. I'll turn it over to Lakshmi. But once again, thank you for the opportunity to be with you.
Yes, thank you so much, John, for sort of discussing the convergence of all of these issues, including money laundering, transnational crime, and the circulation of counterfeits. I'll pass it over to Lakshmi.
Thank you so much, Laila, and thank you, John. And thank you to everyone that's joined us today. When we start talking about the relationship between violent crime, authoritarianism, kleptocracy, it is a complex relationship in that there is no one point of origination or one sector through which it all starts. At the same point, there is no one facilitator or institution through which it moves, and there is no one destination. And that is part of the problem. What is the universal truth in all of this is that it is very much a cross-border issue. It is what is always true is that this money starts off in one place, and it is usually to ensure that this money is protected and safeguarded, finds its way in another place. And in doing this, almost every facet of the economy is exploited. Now, what makes a difference? And this is where authoritarianism really takes a role. And this is where, whenever the US is thinking about how we implement sanctions and what we should do about sanctions policy, what takes a role is the control of the government and the interest of the government in actually stopping the problem. So, for example, when you think about sort of North Korea and Iran as examples as one far end of the spectrum, the issue with North Korea and Iran is that the government in its totality is looking to get around US policy. It is looking to get around sort of US policy on export controls to facilitate terrorist financing. So what you're then dealing with is the entire government and all its resources being utilized to get around international protections against money laundering and terrorist financing. So that is a whole different set of resources. When you think about FinCEN or individuals in the US having to counter, is that you're dealing with a whole of government trying to evade international norms on this. Now, let's say you migrate further down the chain. You think about sort of cartels in Mexico. You think about what's happening with Colombia and the FARC. And you think about sort of, pockets of insurgents and violence in, let's say, that's happening in parts of Africa. What changes then is that the government in part is trying to do something, but at the same time, the government very often can be compromised because these violent groups, either through bribery or corruption, have permeated the government. So that is a second degree that you see there where, yes, the government is involved, but the government is also trying to counter the bad activities of groups that are criminal, cause violence, have access to illicit finance. And that presents a next opportunity where you can make inroads. And sort of the third is examples like we see in the US, which are strong democracy, strong rule of law, where government officials are not hand in glove with criminal actors or, organized crime groups. And that, presents the best case opportunity for cooperation. But being able to risk categorize and understand how much resources you're going to have to put is an important determinant in understanding, the risks that emanate. For example, if you have an authoritarian ruler, if you have like the situation in Venezuela, where yes, it is a government, but essentially it operates like an organized crime group. the amount of resources you're going to have to deal with it is significantly larger because the government as a whole is looking to launder their money. And so that is something that I think is important for us to consider when we talk about solutions and policies. Now, this is not to say that despite this whole of government approach, individual actors will still find ways to hide and loot the country and hide money, whether they're looting it through the timber sector, gold sector, oil sector, but inevitably they want to hide money for themselves. And by ensuring that the US and by ensuring that the countries, not just the US, but countries around the world do not become safe havens for these individual acts, you better protect the system, but you also better protect your national security priorities, better protect against human rights abuses, and most importantly, better protect government and donor efforts to strengthen enforcement in many of these countries. And I know we've talked about real estate, so I don't want to, but if there is a question on real estate, I've got a nifty little slide ready to go for when that question pops up. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Lakshmi. I think you bring up a really important point of how there's no really one point of origin, and both of our second session speakers really pointed to the presence of corruption and the involvement of state actors, because oftentimes I think that we think that the involvement is these illegitimate actors, not legitimate actors, and also that this is an international issue that necessitates sort of a global lens. So I'm going to pose a question to Lakshmi first, if that's okay. What AML and anti-kleptocracy measures can you recommend to address this problem? And how can the US, as a follow-up, how can the United States work with other committed partners to bankrupt complicit enablers of authoritarian states' corruption and criminality, including confiscating their assets?
Absolutely, Laila. And this is my opportunity to show off my nifty little slide because it touches on many of these issues. And so, there's a lot of blood and sweat that's gone into creating these infographics. So every time I have a chance to show it off, believe you me, I will. And so one of the things that I think it's good to talk about is that no matter what the crime, what we are essentially seeing is when money is moving either through the financial system or trade system, it's not like, when I need something, I go to the store, or if I need to buy a house, I walk with the real estate agent to 20 different homes. When you're the politically rich or you're the criminally wealthy, you don't need to do that. What you do is you have a vast array of experts that help you. And that's how you're able to subvert the rules that govern and exist to protect the financial and trade system. And so when we did a report on the issue of just because the real estate sector is a great gateway sector to understand the ways in which, authoritarianism can flourish in the US inadvertently can become a safe haven, because it's not just a US problem. This is something we see over and over again, almost in every developed country where we see money from the developing world, primarily through political corruption and authoritarianism, make its way and find its way into the developed world. And in almost all cases, you see law firms, real estate agents, investment advisors, lobbying agents, PR firms. There is this whole network that either actively helps you hide money or sometimes passively, because it's PR or lobbying firms, they passively ensure that the government, the administration in power, doesn't take any action that is counter to your country. And so there is that relationship where you have a whole set of actors and facilitators and professionals that we point out. And second, when we look at sort of the big picture of the real estate sector, as Luis and others sort of really identified. So one is tackling these professionals that help and assist and are very often complicit. And currently there are no rules. And I think the second thing is when we talk about sort of real estate in the US, for example, our analysis showed that there was about 2.3 billion laundered just across 56 cases over a period of 4 years. So that's about 40 million on average. And we saw that about 53%, over 53% was all political corruption. That is the vast chunk of money that is coming into the US is through political corruption. And so, making sure that you can't give foreign assistance and aid and enforcement and do a fabulous job that the State Department and so many other law enforcement agencies in the US and other countries do. But on the other hand, say, hey, it's a free for all. Venezuela, we will impose sanctions on you. But if you want to put money into our real estate sector, by all means, please walk right through. We will ask you no questions. Both of those can't be solutions because you will fail. And that's what I think we want to say, is that we really want to make sure you start to target sectors that are vulnerable, that hold investment and wealth for long term, and that, you know, at the same time exploit the fact that the US is a strong democracy with a strong rule of law that will protect your property rights. You should not allow the US system to be abused in that manner. And so sort of tackling enablers, tackling sectors that are especially vulnerable, and real estate is one. This is not to say that, you know, I know Claudia talked about the free trade agreements. There are so many other sectors like commodity sectors that are vulnerable. But on US territory, the US real estate sector is the most vulnerable currently.
Thank you so much, Lakshmi, and we always appreciate insightful infographics for things. So thanks for sharing that. I'm going to pose a question to John. So how can innovative technologies, including AI and federated learning, help disrupt the corruptive influence, cybercrimes, and illicit financing of authoritarian states, destabilizing markets and rules-based systems and institutions?
Well, thank you for the question. I could go in a lot of different directions on this, but I'm going to just give two quick thoughts. The first one has to do with trade-based money laundering. It's a subject that I have been involved with for close to 30 years, both as a criminal investigator and then later following it and coming up with some countermeasures for trade-based money laundering. I believe trade-based money laundering is the largest money laundering methodology in the world, hence its importance. What I've been struck with over the last few years is just the absolute explosion in data and analysis, the capability to analyze data sources that I could have only dreamed about before when I was out in the field working these cases. It's a game changer what can be done today, and a lot of this stuff is commercially available. Another thing is blockchain technology. Basically, we have the ability now for the first time to track a good, merchandise, basically manufacturer to end user. This combined with other technical innovations that I don't have the time to go into right now, theoretically gives us the ability to create trade transparency for the very first time. Of course, it's still going to come down to enforcement, but theoretically, trade transparency is achievable. It's a game changer. Now, of course, it comes down to policy. Do actors want to actually go in that direction? One other quick point is authoritarian states such as China and Russia are both introducing national cyber currencies backed by their central banks. These are national cyber currencies, not Bitcoin, national cyber currencies. And to me, this is going to be an absolute game changer. Now, there are many reasons for these moves, including, for example, China and Russia both have long wanted to weaken the US dollar. But the principal reason, the principal reason is control. Combined with the social monitoring that's going on in, for example, China can literally prevent a dissident or a citizen that's on the outs, if you will, from buying and purchasing anything. What they're going to be able to do is to monitor behavior. It's frightening. And on the flip side of all this, Chinese authorities will be in a much better position to control capital flight, which is something they're very, very concerned about, and to fight money laundering. So, I mean, it's actually ironic. We're talking about anti-money laundering, but this technology is going to be able to assist the governments to crack down on capital flight and money laundering. So anyway, I think this is something that is another issue that's coming at us. We need to be aware of it, and I'm very, very interested to see the end results here.
Thank you so much. If we have time, I'm going to maybe pose a question from Traxel and Mahmoud Chengiz. He says, today's kleptocratic leaders are more greedy than their predecessors. There are several leaders in the Middle East who have stolen tens of billions of dollars from their countries, according to the reliable sources. However, we have not seen any effective investigations targeting these leaders. They're able to move money out of their countries and use money laundering techniques to place, layer, and integrate them with legitimate funds. Some of the issues seem to be the reluctance of the Western world because of the influence of politics and the lack of international law enforcement capacity to investigate the stealing of these leaders. So his question at the end is, what are your suggestions for the international community to investigate the corruption cases of these leaders? And if I could ask you to just do a sort of 30-second summary, that would be wonderful. We can go to Lakshmi first, please.
No, absolutely. And I think a big part of that is the countries where this money finds a home, acknowledging their role. For the longest time, we've never had that. So the fact that the White House today has come out and said, yes, we are the home for a lot of politically corrupt money is a significant thing. So, I think primarily targeting enablers, which is professionals that help, is the way to target this political corruption. And the second thing I would say is working in greater concert to share information on a cross-border basis is helpful. And third, as I think Louise earlier pointed out, what the US does is not clear about is when you retain money, and there is a legislation on this called Countering Victims of Kleptocracy Act, which is every time the US through asset forfeiture collects money, the US is to record it and transparently publish how much money there is. So at a later date, when there is greater stability, there is an opportunity to return, but there is also a clear audit trail on this money. So I'll stop there.
Thanks. And John?
I appreciate the question because I firmly believe that a lot of these issues come down to enforcement. You can have the best policies, the best position papers, the best research in the world, but everything that we're talking about truly comes down to an enforcement. And when there's no enforcement, it's just the same old, nothing's going to change. That being said, having been involved with international law enforcement, there are some major issues involved with all of this, including venue. Where's that case going to actually be? What's that case going to actually involve? Venue and jurisdiction. Who has jurisdiction over it, right? The other thing you have to have is international cooperation to work these cases. And sometimes, for example, even though these monies may flow through the United States, where we get venue, we have jurisdiction, say the FBI, whatever, wants to look at this stuff, you still have to have cooperation from the host services. And if we can't get that, then it's very, very difficult to work these cases.
Thank you so much to both of our speakers. I think that was a really tough question at the end, pointing to the challenges and sort of obstacles of international cooperation to address these issues. So we have about 5 minutes before we wrap it up. If there aren't any other questions, I'd actually like to open this question from Matt up to the larger group. Matt asks, how would you predict that the advent of cryptocurrency and other virtual currencies will impact the global illicit economy, trade-based money laundering, and political corruption or kleptocracy? Will cryptocurrency strengthen the connections between these sectors? And I know this is similar to what John was discussing earlier, but if any of the speakers, so from the first or second session, would like to address the cryptocurrency question, that would be great. Yes, Lakshmi, please.
I'm no, sorry. So I'll be quick, so in case anyone else wants to jump in. I think that's a great question. What I will say is that cryptocurrency is a big threat, and it'll continue to be a growing threat, especially when we talk about, activity that is purely criminal. Currently, because so much of the way crypto exchanges have to have a relationship with a financial institution before they can be converted into fiat, we are seeing that in turn is having an impact on sort of whether you see, politicians or others who are otherwise engaged in trade-based money laundering make that shift to cryptocurrency. And so that's a limiting factor. What I will say, and I say this frequently, is that there are so many gaping loopholes. When you talk about trade, internationally, we have no rules on trade-based money laundering. And trade-based money laundering is how the world works. It works through trade. So just on the legitimate trade and financial system, it is still in many ways a free for all because there are just gaping loopholes. So, real estate is a good example. TBML is a good example. The investment sector is a good example. I mean, Ndrangheta, the mafia group, managed to sell $1 billion in private bonds to pension funds and private banks all over Europe, and no one was there to stop them. So I think, yes, cryptocurrency will grow, but we should not forget that cryptocurrency has many challenges in itself that, for a lot of criminals, you would just choose the existing formal financial and trade system as a much easier option through which to hide and grow your illicit financial economy.
Thanks so much, Lakshmi. If any of the speakers wanted to address also the international cooperation question, I don't mean to deny you that opportunity. If there aren't any more, I don't know, I'll give it a few seconds, but we were going to pass it off to Dr. Louise Shelley for the kind of concluding remarks. Lakshmi, I see your hand up. Go ahead.
No, I can take it. So it is a fantastic question, this issue of international cooperation. And I think one of the big challenges we've had is that primarily it's facilitated through what is called the Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty. Now, at the highest level in the Financial Action Task Force, you have FIUs, and it's called the Egmont process, through which FIUs can directly share intelligence. But if you have to use anything for investigation or prosecution, it is done through the MLAT process. And what's been a challenge for many years, and this is in multiple jurisdictions, is that even in the US, because we just did a report looking at that relationship between the Western Hemisphere and the US, is that very often you have multiple legal systems of common law, civil law, language difficulties, judges don't understand each other's laws. And this in turn, for many years, has caused a huge backlog and slowdown. And what we have recommended, and we think this has proven in the past to actually facilitate greater cooperation, is having either someone from the US government embedded in the office that helps with these requests, and vice versa, from someone in our government embedded. And that actually speeds up the process and makes for better mutual cooperation. But having said this, you always have to be careful that the government you're engaging in this relationship with is someone you can trust. They're not going to take sensitive information and then it makes it easier for someone to get around. So with those caveats, there are the mutual legal assistance processes where the greatest vulnerability is, because that is primarily the mechanism through which information is shared.
Thank you, Lakshmi. I'll pass it off to Louise.
Thank you all for joining us today from literally all around the world. And we want to thank our speakers from AITI, NDI, Global Financial Integrity, and David Luna, who put this together with Laila Hashemi, and bring together a coherent picture, starting from sort of laying out the issues as we first did in the first half, of how many countries, what acute regions are suffering from this, what are the consequences of it, not only for those regions, but for this corruption in our country. And then this very excellent panel by Lakshmi Kumar and John Kasara on very concrete ways to deal with this problem. And that is something that we hope the Biden Democracy Summit will follow up with, is concrete ways to help address these acute issues that are undermining democracy and life for millions and millions, if not billions of people on the planet. So thank you, and we hope you'll join a future event of ours in the future. And goodbye. Thank you.